Bind Your Hair by Robert Aickman. No one seemed able to fathom Clorinda Hartley. She had a small but fastidious flat near Church Street, Kensington, and a responsible job in a large, non-committal commercial organization. No one who knew her now had ever known her in any other residence or any other job. She entertained a little, never more nor less over the years, went out not infrequently with men, and for her holidays simply disappeared, returning with brief references to foreign parts. No one seemed to know her really well, and in the course of time there came to be wide differences of opinion about her age, and recurrent speculation about her emotional life. The latter topic was not made less urgent by a certain distinction in her appearance, and also in her manner. She was very tall, a great handicap, of course, in the opinion of many, and well-shaped. She had very fair, very fine, very abundant hair, to which she plainly gave much attention. Her face had interesting planes, for those who could appreciate them, but also soft curves, which went with her hair. She had a memorable voice, high-pitched but gentle. She was, in fact, 32. Everyone was greatly surprised when she announced her engagement to Dudley Carstairs. Or rather, it was Carstairs who announced it. He could not keep it to himself as long as there was anyone within earshot who was ignorant of it, and well might he be elated, because his capture followed a campaign of several years' continuance, and supported by few sweeping advantages. He worked in the same office as Clorinda, and in a not unsatisfactory position for his 30 years, and was in every way a thoroughly presentable person, but even in the office there were a number of others like him, and it would have seemed possible that Clorinda could have further extended her range of choice by going outside. The weekend after the engagement, Dudley arranged for her to spend with him and his parents in Northamptonshire. Mr. Carstairs, Sr., had held an important position on the administrative side of the Northampton boot and shoe industry, and when he retired upon a fair pension, had settled in a small but comfortable house in one of the remote parts of a country where the remote parts are surprisingly many and extensive. Mr. Carstairs had been a pioneer in this particular because others similarly placed had tended their retirement to emigrate to the Sussex coast or the New Forest, but his initiative, as often happens in such cases, had been imitated until the little village in which he had settled was now largely populated by retired industrial executives and portions of their families. Clorinda would have been grateful for more time in which to adjust herself to Dudley in the capacity of accepted lover, but Dudley somehow did not seem to see himself in that capacity, and to be reluctant in any way to defer Clorinda's full involvement with her new family position. Clorinda, having said yes to what was believed to be the major question, smiled slightly, and said yes to the minor. Mr. Carstairs, Sr., met them at Road Station. "Hello, Dad." The two men gazed at one another's shoes, not wanting to embrace and hesitating to shake hands. Mr. Carstairs was smiling, benignly expectant. Plainly he was one who considered that life had treated him well. Almost, one believed, he was ready to accept his son's choice of a bride as, for him, joy's crown of joy. "Dad, this is Clorinda." "I say, my boy." Outside the station was a gray Standard, in which Mr. Carstairs drove them many miles to the west. Already the sun was sinking. Soon after they arrived they had settled down, and Mrs. Carstairs and Dudley's sister Elizabeth took crumpets in the long winter dusk. Elizabeth had a secretarial position in Leamington, and bicycled there and back every day. All of them were charmed with Clorinda. She exceeded their highest, and perhaps not very confident, hopes. Clorinda responded to their happy approval of her, and smiled at Dudley's extreme pleasure at being home. An iced cake had been baked for her specially, and she wondered whether these particular gilt-edged cups were in daily use. They neither asked her questions nor talked mainly about themselves. They all made a warm-hearted, not unskillful effort to make her feel completely one with them from the outset. She and Elizabeth discovered a common interest in the theater, shared only in a lesser degree by Dudley. But Leamington's so stuffy that no one's ever made a theater play here. Not since the war, said Mr. Carstairs in affectionate qualification. Not since the First War, said Elizabeth. Is Leamington the nearest town? Asked Clorinda. It's the nearest as the crow flies or as Elizabeth cycles, said Dudley, but it's not the quickest when you're coming from London. Narrow lanes all the way. Fortunately, we've got our own friends by now in the village, said Mrs. Carstairs. I've asked some of them in for drinks so that you can meet them at once. And, indeed, almost immediately the bell rang, and the first of the visitors was upon them. Mr. Carstairs went round the room putting on lights and drawing the curtains. Every now and then he gave some jocular direction to Dudley, who was complimentarily engaged. A domestic servant of some kind, referred to by Mrs. Carstairs as our local woman, had removed the remains of tea, and by the time Elizabeth had borne in a tray of drinks, 3 more visitors had added themselves to the first 2. "Can I help?" Clorinda had said. "No," the Carstairs family had replied. "Certainly not. Not yet." Altogether, there were 11 visitors, only 2 of whom were under 40. All 11 of them Clorinda liked very much less than she liked the Carstairs family. Then, just as several of them were showing signs of departure, a 12th arrived, who made a considerable change. A woman of medium height and in early middle age, she had a lined and sallow face, but an alert expression and large, deeply set black eyes. She had untidy, shoulder-length black hair, which tended to separate itself into distinct, compact strands. Her only makeup appeared to be an exceptionally vivid lipstick, abundantly applied to her large, square mouth. She entered in a luxuriant fur coat, but at once cast it off, so that it lay on the floor, and appeared in a black corduroy skirt and a black silk blouse, cut low, and with long, tight sleeves. On her feet were heel-less golden slippers. "I've been so busy." She seized both of Mrs. Carstairs' hands. Her voice was very deep and melodious, but marred by a certain hoarseness or uncertainty of timbre. "Where is she?" Mrs. Carstairs was smiling amiably as ever, but all conversation in the room had stopped. "Do go on talking." The newcomer addressed the party at random. She had now observed Clorinda. "Introduce me," she said to Mrs. Carstairs, as if her hostess were being a little slow with her duties. "Or am I too late?" Her sudden quick smile was possibly artificial, but certainly bewitching. For a second, various men in the room missed the thread of their resumed conversations. "Of course you're not too late," said Mrs. Carstairs. Then she made the introduction. "Clorinda Hartley, Mrs. Pagani." "Nothing whatever to do with the restaurant," said Mrs. Pagani. "How do you do?" said Clorinda. Mrs. Pagani had a firm and even but somewhat bony handshake. She was wearing several large rings, with heavy stones in them, and round her neck a big fat locket on a thick golden chain. By now Mrs. Carstairs had brought Mrs. Pagani a drink. "Here's to the future," said Mrs. Pagani, looking into Clorinda's eyes, and as soon as Mrs. Carstairs had turned away, drained the glass. "Thank you," said Clorinda. "Do sit down," said Mrs. Pagani, as if the house were hers. "Thank you," said Clorinda, falling in with the allusion. Mrs. Pagani stretched out an arm. Clorinda noticed that her arms, in their tight black sleeves, were uncommonly long, and pulled up a chair upon which she sat. Clorinda noticed also that when she was seated, her hips looked too bony and obtrusive. Altogether, Mrs. Pagani gave an impression of unusual physical power, only partly concealed by her conventional clothes. It was as if suddenly she might arise and tear down the house. "You cannot imagine," said Mrs. Pagani, "how much it means to me to have someone new in the village, especially someone more or less my own age, or perhaps you can." "But I'm not going to live here," said Clorinda, clutching hold of the main point. "Well, of course not. But there will be frequent weekends. Whatever else may be said for or against Dudley, he's devoted to his home." Clorinda nodded thoughtfully. She was aware that everyone's eyes were upon them, and realized that Mrs. Pagani had so far acknowledged the presence of none of the other guests, well though she must presumably know them. "Who would want to know any of these people? inquired Mrs. Pagani in a husky, telepathic undertone. One trouble was that Clorinda rather agreed with her. Why do you live here? I can't live in towns, and in the country people are the same wherever you go. Most people, I mean. You don't live in the country for the local society. Clorinda failed to ask why you did live in the country. Elizabeth came up with more drinks. "Hello, Elizabeth," said Mrs. Pagani. For some reason, Elizabeth went very red. "Hello, Mrs. Pagani." She left 2 drinks with them and hurried away on her errand of hospitality. Mrs. Pagani's eyes followed her for a few seconds. Then she turned back to Clorinda and said, "We two will be seeing a lot of one another." Again, Clorinda could only nod. "I needn't tell you that you're not what I expected. Do you know where I live?" Clorinda, still silent, shook her head. "Have you been round the village yet?" "No." "Not seen the church?" "It was getting dark when I arrived." "I live in the courtyard," Mrs. Pagani suddenly shouted with laughter. "It always surprises people." She placed her long, bony left hand on Clorinda's knee. "There used to be a chapel in the churchyard with a room over it. This is a thinly populated district, and they brought the corpses from the farmhouses and cottages, often a long, slow journey, and left the coffin in the chapel waiting for the funeral the next day. And the mourners passed the night upstairs, watching and, of course, drinking. When all of this became unnecessary, the chapel fell into ruin. The parish council was glad to sell it to me. The vicar's 101 anyway. I restored it, and I live in it. The ground had to be specially deconsecrated for me." Mrs. Pagani removed her hand and picked up her glass. "Come and see me." For the second time she toasted Clorinda. "I call it the charnel house. Not quite correct, of course. A charnel house is where the dead lie after the funeral, but I thought the name rather suited me." Suddenly her attention was distracted. Without moving her eyes, she inclined her head slightly sideways. "Just look at Mr. Appleby. Used to be managing director of an important company, Appleby's Arterial Bootlaces." Clorinda could not see that Mr. Appleby, with whom she had been talking before Mrs. Pagani's arrival, was doing anything much out of the ordinary. He seemed simply to be telling stories to 2 or 3 other guests, who admittedly seemed less interested than he was. But Clorinda was unaccustomed to making 12 or 15 intimate acquaintances for life en bloc, and all coming within the, at best, uncertain category of friends' friends. Again, Mrs. Pagani had drained her glass. "I must be going. I only looked in for a minute. I have a lot to do tonight." She rose and held out her hand. "Tomorrow, then?" "Thank you very much, but I'm not quite sure. I expect Mr. and Mrs. Carstairs have some plans for me." Mrs. Pagani looked her in the eyes, then nodded. "Yes. You mustn't quarrel with them. That's very important. Well, come if you can." "Thank you. I'd like to." Mrs. Pagani was resuming her expansive sable coat and saying goodbye to Mrs. Carstairs. "You've nothing to worry about," Clorinda heard her say. "Dudley's chosen well." "Darling!" It was Dudley, standing behind Clorinda's chair. He kissed the top of her head. "Don't mind her. She's far round the bend, of course, but good-hearted at bottom. Anyway, she's the only one of her kind in the village. Pots of money, too." "What makes you think that, Dudley?" asked the marzipan voice of Mr. Appleby. Conversation about Mrs. Pagani was now general. "Couldn't behave as she does if she hadn't, Mr. Appleby," replied Dudley. That seemed to be the consensus of opinion. When everyone had gone, they listened to the radio. Then they had supper, and Clorinda was permitted, after strenuous application, to participate in the washing up. As they retired in a warm mist of gently affectionate demonstrativeness, the thought crossed Clorinda's mind that she might like to sleep with Dudley. It was still not an urgent wish, only a thought, but in Dudley there was no evidence that was even a thought. For him, the fateful outer wall of the fortress had been successfully battered down after a long siege. The course of time would bring the later degrees of capitulation. The next morning, Clorinda had to admit to herself that she was very depressed. As she lay in bed watching wisps of late autumn fog drift and swirl past her window, she felt that inside the house was a warm and cozy emptiness in which she was about to be lost. She saw herself, her real self, forever suspended in blackness, howling in the lonely dark, miserable and unheard, while her other, outer self went smiling through an endless, purposeless routine of love for and compliance with a family and a community of friends which, however excellent, were exceedingly unlike her, in some way that she did not fully understand. Elizabeth might bill and coo about the theater, but it could hardly be said that any one of them had a sense of drama. They lived in the depths of the country, but had no idea of the wilderness. They were constantly together, but knew one another too well to be able to converse. Individuality had been eroded from all of them by the tides of common sentiment. "Love me," said Dudley in effect, his eyes softly glowing. "Love mine." His London personality seemed merely a bait with which to entice her into the capacious family lobster pot. Mrs. Pagani was certainly different from the rest of them, but Clorinda was far from sure that Mrs. Pagani was her idea of an ally. Then she got up, turned on the big electric heater, and felt that her thoughts had been the morbid product of lying too long abed. Moreover, the flying swaths of fog were most beautiful. She stood in her nightdress by the window looking at them, with the heater behind her sending ripples of warmth up her back. It was an old sash window with the original well-proportioned glazing bars. The new white paint covered numerous undercurrents in the surface of earlier coats. Clorinda liked such details in the house, always kept neat and spruce, like an old dandy whom people still cared about. But from breakfast onwards, her spirits once more began to sink. One trouble was that the Carstairs family, in fact, had no plans for her whatever, nor had Dudley individually. There was a half-hearted suggestion of church, which no one seemed wishful to keep alive, and after that a sequence of minor interruptions and involved jobs, which Clorinda felt could be much better organized, but which everyone else seemed quietly to enjoy as they were. The whole family, Dudley included, seemed to like even the most pointless chores simply because they were being undertaken collectively. The four of them did all they could to give Clorinda a place in the various undertakings, and Clorinda hated the perverse barrier which seemed more and more to isolate her from their kindness. But when, by the middle of the afternoon, Sunday luncheon was a substantial reaping of the morning seed time, no one had even suggested a walk. She did something precipitate. Without speaking to Dudley, who was helping his father in the garden, she went up to her bedroom, changed into a pair of trousers and a sweater, donned her mackintosh, wrote on the inside of a cigarette box, "Gone for a walk, back soon," and quietly left the house. The swaths of fog were still sweeping before the wind, but, though damp, it was not a cold wind nor unfriendly. Immediately she was away from the house, Clorinda felt alive again. After walking a few hundred yards rather furtively, she ascended a roadside bank from which the grass had recently been sickled, and looked about her. She was looking for the church, and when, through a break in the mist, she saw the battlemented top of the yellow stone tower, with a jutting gargoyle at each corner, she knew which way she would go. She turned her back on the church, and walked away from the few cottages which made up the village. Mrs. Pagani had possibly served a purpose as serio-comic relief the previous evening, but Clorinda had no wish to enlarge the acquaintanceship. The patches of cloud and fog drifted and lifted, making constant changes of scene. There was no hope of sunshine, but the mist was uncharged with smoke, and served to melt the sharp air of winter and to enclose Clorinda with an advancing tent of invisibility. Other than Clorinda's light, quick step on the granite chips of the old-fashioned narrow road, the only sound was the dripping of water from the trees, the hedges, the occasional gates. At the tip of every leaf was a fat pearl about to drop and vanish. Clorinda realized that her hair was becoming damp. She bundled it onto the top of her head, soaking her hands in the process, then drew a long black scarf from her mackintosh pocket and twisted it into a tight turban. The road seemed to be lined with dripping trees, which appeared dimly, one at a time, grew into a fullness of detail which had seemed impossible a minute before, and then dissolved away even from the backward glance, but the air also was itself heavy with soft wetness. Soft and wet, but good on the face. "Let there be wet," quoted Clorinda to herself in her clear, gentle voice. "Oh, let there be wet." She had seen no one in the village, and if there were animals in the fields, the mist cut off sight and hearing of them. Clorinda was aware that she might have some difficult personal problems almost immediately ahead of her, but she thought nothing of them as the renewal of contact with the country, the adventurous loneliness of her walk, suffused her with their first freshness. Out of the mist advanced a small square notice board, lopsided on top of a sloping wooden pole. "No right of way," read Clorinda. "Persons proceed beyond this point by favor only." It was perhaps an unusual announcement, and not made more convincing by the misspelling and by the crudeness of the erection, but Clorinda had heard of landowners who close gates on one day each year in order to prevent the establishment of an easement, and there seemed to be no change whatever in the nature or surface of the road, at least in the short distance ahead which was visible. Clorinda continued her walk. No one, however, is entirely unaffected, either towards carefulness or towards challenge, by passing such a notice, and in due course Clorinda realized that she was walking more slowly. Then she perceived that the road itself had for some time been rising slightly but continuously. It also seemed narrower, and the hedges higher. Clorinda stopped and looked at her watch. Despite the muffling mist, she could hear its ticking with extreme clarity, so silent were the hidden pastures around her. It had been something before 3 o'clock when she had crept out of the house. It was now something after 1/2 past. She had possibly another hour of daylight. If she went on for a quarter of that hour, there would be as much time in which to return as she had taken upon the outward journey, and the way back was along a known road, and one which inclined downhill. Moreover, there had not been a single crossroads or doubtful turning, and in any case Clorinda liked walking in the dark. Certainly neither her mind nor her stomach was inclined to a cozy crumpet tea with the Carstairs family, or to a further session bound, like Catherine upon her wheel, to the mark of interrogation which Dudley remained for her. Again, therefore, she continued her walk. The gradient increased, but the trees came more quickly, imperceptibly losing, tree by tree, the moment of clear detail which had previously characterized each of them. The road had begun to wind steeply upwards through a wood. Now the hedges, lately so high, had ceased, but the road, although the antique metalling seemed more and more lost in the damp, loamy soil, remained distinct. Intermittently, the going had become a little muddy, but the softness underfoot made a change from the angular granite. The trees had now become dim and uniform shapes, which passed so quickly and monotonously that sometimes they seemed almost to move, as in a very early cinematograph. Then, unmistakably, something else was moving. From among the tall, thin trees, and out of the veiling mist, came a small animal. It crossed the track 10 or 12 feet in front of Clorinda, and disappeared again almost at once. It neither walked nor ran, but slowly ambled. It was not quite silent, but the atmosphere made the sound of its passage seem insufficient. It whispered and sighed its way through the undergrowth. Clorinda could not think what animal it was. Probably a dog, which the mist had misshaped. She checked for a moment, then went on. Swiftly and momentarily the mist cleared a larger area around her, as she had seen it do several times before. She could see many trees, and could now perceive also that they were beeches. Dotted about the bare earth which surrounds beech trees, even in a thick wood, were many more of the animals. They were pigs. Each of the pigs seemed very intent about its business, softly snuffling after unknown sweets in the naked soil. None grunted or squeaked, but the dead brown paper leaves rustled slightly as the herd rooted. The pigs were on both sides of the track, and again Clorinda hesitated briefly before advancing through the midst of them. At first they took no notice of her, perhaps she thought unafraid of man because little knowing him, and the tent of mist, temporarily a marquee, advanced with her on to the wooded heights ahead. Then, most unexpectedly, there came from the obscurity 30 yards away on Clorinda's right a shattering animal shriek, short but so loud and high as to pain the ear. All the pigs looked up, stood motionless for a second, then massed together in the direction the sound had come from, some of them crossing the track behind and ahead of her for the purpose. Again they stood, an indistinct agglomeration on the edge of the mist, then suddenly swept back the way they had come. The whole herd, packed tightly together, charged across the track and disappeared into the mist on the left. The pigs had passed no more than 5 or 6 feet in front of Clorinda, who was able to observe that in the very middle of the throng was a creature much larger than the rest, a bristling, long-snouted boar, with large, curving, bluish-white tusks. He it was, she suspected, that had cried from the enveloping mist. She had never before seen such a creature, and was slightly alarmed. The scampering flight of the pigs could be heard for a few seconds after the fog had surrounded them. Then the wood was silent again. It was as if the pigs had been the last creatures left alive in it. The fog had now closed up again, scudding across the track on a wind which seemed colder and stronger than it had been in the village at the beginning of Clorinda's walk. But the track was now rising steeply, and the extra exertion kept her warm. The long-drawn-out winter dusk must have begun, because not until she was right upon them did Clorinda notice 2 figures on the path. They were children. They did not seem to be either ascending or descending, but to be quietly waiting by the side of the track for someone to pass. They were identically dressed in one-piece waterproof garments, like small, trim diving suits, bright blue in color and provided with hoods. One child had its hood over its head, but the other was bareheaded and displayed a curly mass of silky flaxen hair, much the color of Clorinda's own in childhood. The bareheaded child had blue eyes, very widely spaced, and a pale skin. The face of the other child was shadowed by its hood, and from Clorinda's altitude amounted to little more than a long red mouth. Both children, Clorinda noticed, had long red mouths. She was unable to determine their sex. "Excuse me," said the bareheaded child very politely. Clorinda decided it was a girl. The girl spoke well. Clorinda stopped. The little girl smiled, charmingly. "Have you seen the pigs?" She spoke as if the pigs were a matter of common interest to them, and automatically identifiable, as if a straggler from a hunt had asked, had she seen the hounds? "Yes, Clorinda. Are they your pigs?" "How long ago?" asked the child, with a child's disregard of side issues. "About 5 minutes ago," Clorinda looked at her watch. 3:45. Time to go back. "As a matter of fact, I'm afraid I frightened them." "Silly old pigs," said the child, fortunately taking Clorinda's side. "Which way did they go? This way? Or that way?" She indicated up the hill, or down. Clorinda thought that she was about 8. "That way, I'm afraid," said Clorinda, pointing vaguely into the mist. "I hope they'll not get lost in the fog." "There's always a fog," said the child. Clorinda let that one go. "What happens if I get to the top?" she asked. The hooded child, who had said nothing, suddenly made an odd movement. It raised one foot and stamped on the ground. It was as if its whole small body were swept by a spasm. The movement reminded Clorinda of an animal which had been startled and pawed the earth. A large animal, moreover. In the child seemed to be a disproportionate strength. Clorinda was really frightened by it. "There's a lovely view, some days," said the bareheaded child, helpfully. "Not much good this evening." The child shook its head, smiling politely. The hooded child snatched at the bareheaded child's sleeve and pulled it, sharply. "There's a maze." The bareheaded child was showing off slightly, but meaning to help also. "What kind of maze? With hedges? I don't believe it." To Clorinda, a maze meant Hampton Court. "An ordinary maze. You have to look for it, though." "How far away?" "Quite near." "Where do I look?" Clearly the child was speaking the truth, and Clorinda was interested. "In among the bushes. There's a little path." Clorinda noticed that the second child had cocked up its head and was looking at her. It seemed to have sharp, sallow features and big eyes. In its hood, it was not unlike a falcon. Shall I get lost in the maze? The bareheaded child appeared unable to understand this question and looked at Clorinda disappointedly. Well, that's up to me, said Clorinda, coming to the rescue. The child nodded. She had still not understood.
Thank you for telling us about the pigs.
Thank you for telling me about the maze. The little girl smiled her pretty smile. Really, I never saw such a beautiful child, thought Clorinda. The children departed quickly down the hill. In a moment they had vanished. Clorinda again looked at her watch. 3:50. She decided that she would give 15 minutes to looking for the child's maze, and that even then she would be back soon after 5. Before long she reached a gate. It was at the edge of the wood and the end of the track. Outside the wood was short, down-like grass, mossy with moisture. Clorinda's feet sank into it, as into very soft rubber. There were frequent, irregularly placed clumps of thorny scrub, and no sign of even the sketchiest path. The wind was still growing chillier, and the mist was darkening all the time. Clorinda had not gone 50 yards from the gate when she decided to return. The question of whether or not it would be worth looking for the maze did not arise. On top of the hill it would be easy to lose oneself without entering a maze. In the dim light she perceived that a man was leaning against the gate and facing her. He had red curly hair which had receded slightly at the sides, and a prominent nose. He wore pale-hued riding breeches and dark boots. Across his shoulders was a fur cape, which Clorinda vaguely connected with the idea of aviation. As Clorinda approached, he neither spoke nor moved. He saw that in his right hand he held a long, thick shepherd's crook. It was black, and reached from the ground to his shoulder. Clorinda put her hand on the wooden drawbar of the gate. She assumed that this action would make the man move. But he continued leaning on the gate and regarding her. If she opened the gate, he would fall. I want to go through. It was not an occasion for undue politeness. Without change of expression, the man swiftly placed his left hand on the other end of the drawbar. Clorinda pushed at it, but it would not give. Not given to panic, Clorinda momentarily considered the situation and began to climb the gate. "Hello," said a voice behind her. "Rufo! What do you suppose you're doing?" Unmistakably, it was the voice of Mrs. Pagani. Clorinda stepped down. Mrs. Pagani was also wearing high boots, and her head was enveloped like Clorinda's in a dark scarf, but, strangely, she was wearing the capacious and opulent fur coat in which Clorinda had first seen her. The top of her boots were hidden beneath it. "Rufo!" Mrs. Pagani spoke to the man by the gate, as if she were calling off a foolish and over-demonstrative dog. The man said something in a strange language. It was so unlike any language Clorinda had heard that, at first, she thought he had a defect in his speech. Mrs. Pagani, however, replied to him in what was presumably the same tongue. In her mouth it sounded less unfamiliar because she lacked his oddly throaty delivery. Clorinda wondered whether this might be Romany. The man was remonstrating against Mrs. Pagani's reproof. Her reply was curious. She was fluently pantomimic, and Clorinda could not but gather that Rufo was being told that she, Clorinda, was to be admitted where others were to be denied. The man scowled and leered, then shuffled off. Although young and apparently strong, he stumbled in his gait and leaned on his crook. There was now very little light, but after he had gone a few paces, he appeared to draw his fur cape high over the back of his head. "What can you think of Rufo?" Clorinda often found Mrs. Pagani's remarks difficult to answer. "Will you forgive him? And me?" "There's nothing to forgive. I didn't know he couldn't speak English." "How could you?" Clorinda got the impression that the tone of this was not apologetic, but amicably ironical. Not for the first time she thought that Mrs. Pagani implied some understanding between them which did not exist. "And will you come back?" It was ridiculous, but Mrs. Pagani had saved her from a menacing situation, so she had to say something. "When should I come back?" "Tonight." The intonation made it plain that no other time could be in question. "Here?" Mrs. Pagani said nothing, but dropped her head to one side and smiled. It was almost impossible after that to seek a reason. Moreover, Mrs. Pagani left no time. "You've bound your hair very well." Miss Clorinda had been noticing how carefully Mrs. Pagani's own thick locks had been turbaned. It was getting wet. Mrs. Pagani nodded and smiled. She was looking Clorinda over.
Au revoir.
Clorinda had not expected that either. Goodbye. Thank you for rescuing me.
My dear, we wouldn't lose you.
Mrs. Pagani strode off. The plural was a new mystery, for Clorinda felt that it could not refer to Rufo. Although by now it was night, Clorinda leaped and ran down the dark track. At one time she thought she heard the pigs softly rooting in the invisible undergrowth, but she did not stop to listen and duly reached the house only a few minutes after 5. Dudley seemed to take her escapade for granted, although she provided no details. Clorinda wondered whether this suggested that already he was growing accustomed to her, or whether it was evidence that he would be a good and unexacting husband, prepared to allow her due liberty and no questions asked. She certainly valued his success in persuading his family to adopt the same attitude.
Out at night in winter, said Mrs. Carstairs, when you don't have to be.
And upon her gentle mark of exclamation, the matter dropped, and tea began. Clorinda wondered whether their surprising equanimity was a product of Dudley's leadership in a full discussion during her absence. She liked Dudley for not fussing, whatever his reasons. Elizabeth had got out a quantity of clothes and ranged them round the room for inspection and comparison by Clorinda. This was a lengthy undertaking. In the end, there was a knock at the door. "Liz!" It was Dudley's voice outside. "One moment." Elizabeth drew on a sweater. "Now." Dudley entered. "I've been sent up to fetch you both downstairs." He smiled fraternally. "We're ready," said Elizabeth, looking at Clorinda as woman to woman. On the dark landing outside, Dudley held Clorinda back for a moment and embraced her. "Go on, Liz, you fool." Elizabeth went on. "You understand?" said Dudley to Clorinda. "At least I hope you do. I've been trying to keep out of sight as far as possible so that you can get to know the family. That walk of yours, I've been wondering." Clorinda squeezed his hand. "It's all right? And do you like them?" "Of course it's all right, and I like them very much." Every Sunday evening, Clorinda understood, Mr. Carstairs read aloud from about 6:30 until they had supper at 8. Tonight the start had been delayed by her walk and by the discussion in Elizabeth's bedroom, but still there was time for 4 chapters of persuasion. Mr. Carstairs read well, Clorinda thought, and the book was new to her. Dudley, who could be convincing in such matters, had somehow contrived to arrange that both of them could arrive late at the office the next day. Otherwise, they would have had to return to London that same night. Soon after supper, Elizabeth had disappeared upstairs, saying she had some letters to write, and that she probably would not be coming down again. She bade Clorinda good night and kissed her affectionately on the cheekbone. About half an hour later, Mr. and Mrs. Carstairs also withdrew. Dudley went to assist his father with stoking up the boiler for the night. The clock struck 9:30. Otherwise, the house was very quiet. Clorinda supposed that she and Dudley were being purposefully left to themselves. "I wish we could live in the country," said Dudley when he reappeared. "I expect we could." "Not the real country, not unless I get another job." "Where does the real country begin?" "About Berkhamsted, or perhaps Tring. Nowadays, that is. The country stretches in this direction only." Clorinda smiled at him. "For me it does, darling." She had not yet got into the habit of his calling her darling. "I belong around here." "But surely until recently you lived in a town. Northampton is a town, isn't it?" She really wasn't quite sure. "Yes, but I was always out and about." Clorinda had observed that every normal English male believes that he wants to live in the country, and said no more. Dudley talked for some time about the advantages of the arrangement. Then he stopped, and Clorinda perceived that he was waiting for her assent. There was a slight pause. "Dudley," said Clorinda, "how well do your father and mother know Mrs. Pagani?" "Not very well," said Dudley, faintly disappointed. "What you would call a bare acquaintanceship." "Why?" "They asked her to the party."
Actually, they didn't. She heard about it and just came. Not the first time she's done it either, but you can't put on side in a small village, and she's not a bad old bird, really. How do you know? I don't, said Dudley, grinning at her earnestness. So what? What does she do with herself? Live on, I mean. I don't know what she lives on, darling. Little children, I expect, like Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother. You know she occupies an old ruin in the churchyard? So she told me. I should like to go and see it. What? Now? Will you come with me? It's a bit late for calls in the country. I'm not suggesting a call, I just want to have a look round. She might think that a trifle nosy, mightn't she? Clorinda nodded. Of course, you know Mrs. Pagani better than I do. She suddenly remembered a nocturnal stroll in Marseille with a fellow tourist who had proved unexpectedly delightful. Tell you what I'll do, said Dudley. I'll whistle you round before we push off to Rhodes tomorrow. We mustn't miss the train. Never missed a train in my life. Clorinda's second night was worse than her first, because now she couldn't sleep at all. Dudley had considered that they should go their separate ways soon after 11, in order, as he said, not to disturb Mr. and Mrs. Carstairs, and when the church clock, brooding over Mrs. Pagani's romantic residence, struck 1, Clorinda was still tense and tumultuous in the prickly dark. Without switching on the light, she got out of bed and crossed to the window. She hoped that the sudden chill would numb her writhing nerves. When, an hour and a half before, she had drawn back the curtains and opened the window at top and bottom, she had noticed that the mist seemed at last to have vanished, although it was so black that it was hard to be sure. Now the moon was rising, low and enormous, as if at the horizon the bottom edge of it dragged against the earth, and Clorinda saw that all indeed was clear, the sky starry, the mist withdrawn to the distant shadowy hills. In the foreground there was nothing to be seen but the silent fields and naked trees. Swiftly, a bat loomed against the night and flew smack against the outer sash. Another 2 feet higher or 2 feet lower, and he would have been in. Clorinda softly shivered for a moment, then watched the bat skid into invisibility. The silver-gilt autumn night was somehow warmer and more welcoming than Clorinda's unadventurous bed, fellow bed, twin bed to 1,000 others in 1,000 well-ordered houses. The grave self-sufficiency of the night was seeping into Clorinda's bloodstream, renewing her audacity, inflaming her curiosity, and its moonlit beauty agitating her heart. By the light of the big moon, she began to dress. When, upon her return from the woods, she had taken off her walking shoes, she had thought them very wet, but now they seemed dried, as if by the moon's rays. She opened the door of her room. Again, a bat struck the window at the end of the passage outside. There was no other sound but that of disturbed breathing, which, however, seemed all around her. The other occupants of the house slept, but, as it appeared, uneasily. She descended the stairs and creaked into her mackintosh before trying the door. She expected difficulty here, but it opened at a touch. Doubtless it would be side to lock one's doors in a village. The moon shone on the gate and on the lane beyond, but the long path from the front door was in darkness. With the moon so low, the house cast a disproportionate shadow. As Clorinda walked down the narrow strip of paving, a hare scuttled across her feet. She could feel his warmth on her ankles as he nearly tripped her. The gate had a patent catch, which had caused her trouble before, and she had to stand for half a minute, fumbling. As she walked along the road, past the by favor only notice, and began to ascend into the wood, she never doubted that at the top of the hill would be some remarkable warrant for her efforts, and she was resolved to find out what that was. Now, the regular roadside trees were as clear-cut and trim as a guard of honor, and the owls seemed to be passing a message ahead of her into the thickets. Once or twice, when entering a straighter part of the road, she thought she saw a shambling figure rounding the distant corner ahead, but she decided that it was probably only a shadow. The bats were everywhere, hurtling in and out of the dark patches and fluting their strange cries, which Clorinda was always so glad that she was among those who were privileged to hear. There were even some surviving or revitalized moths, and a steadily rising perfume of moisture and decay.
The gate at the hilltop was shut, but as soon as Clorinda drew near, she saw the little blue girl standing by it.
"Hello."
"Hello," said Clorinda.
"You're rather late."
"I'm very sorry, I didn't know."
"It's important to be punctual."
The child spoke in a tone of earnest helpfulness. "I'll try to remember," said Clorinda humbly. The child had opened the gate and was leaning back against the end of it, her chin stuck in her neck and her feet in the ground, holding it for Clorinda. Clorinda passed through. The moon was now higher, and the soft grass glistened and gleamed. Even in the almost bright light, there was no sign of a continuing path. "I shall get my feet wet."
"Yes, you will. You should wear boots."
Clorinda observed the legs of the child's blue garment were stuck into close-fitting black Wellingtons. Also, its hood was now over its head. There was no sign of the other child. The little girl had carefully shut the gate. She stood looking ruefully at Clorinda's feet. Then, apparently deciding there was nothing to be done about them, she said very politely,
"Shall I show you where you change?"
"Can I change my shoes?" asked Clorinda, humoring her.
"No, I don't think you can change your shoes," said the child very seriously.
"Only everything else." "I don't want to change anything else." The child regarded her, all at sea. Then, perhaps considering that she must have misunderstood, said,
"It's over there. Follow me, and do take care of your feet."
It certainly was very wet, but the grass proved to be tussocky, and Clorinda did her best to keep dry by striding from tussock to tussock in the moonlight.
"Rufo's in there already," said the child conversationally. "You see, you're the last."
"I've said I'm sorry."
"It doesn't matter."
This was uttered with that special magnanimity only found in the very young. The little girl waited on, and Clorinda struggled after her. There was no sign of anyone else. Indeed, the place looked a hilltop of the dead. The lumpy, saturated grass and the rank and stunted vegetation compared most unfavorably with the handsome trees behind. There was one place where the briars and ragged bushes were particularly dense and abundant, constituting a small, prickly copse. Round the outskirts of this copse, the child led the way, until Clorinda saw that embedded in its perimeter was a rickety shed. Possibly constructed for some agricultural purpose, but long abandoned by its maker, it drooped and sagged into the ground. From it came a penetrating and repugnant odor, like all the bad smells of nature and the stockyard merged together. "That's it," said the little girl, pointing. They were still some yards off, but the feral odor from the shed was already making Clorinda feel sick. "I don't think I want to go in there."
"But you must. Rufo's in there. All the others changed long ago."
Apart from other considerations, the shed seemed too small to house many, and Clorinda could now see that the approach to it was thick with mud, which added its smell to the rest. She was sure that the floor of the shed was muddy almost to the knees. The child's face was puckered with puzzlement. "I'm sorry," said Clorinda, "but you know I don't want to change at all." Clearly she was behaving in quite the wrong way, but the child took a grip on the situation and said,
"Wait here. I'll go and ask."
"All right," said Clorinda, "but I'll wait over there, if you don't mind." The child seemed not to notice the awful smell, but Clorinda was not going to be the first to mention it.
"There,"
said the child, pointing to an exact spot. Clorinda took up her stance upon it.
"Mind you don't move."
"Not if you hurry." The smell was still very detectable.
"Quite still,"
insisted the child. "Quite still," said Clorinda. Swiftly, the child ran 3 times round Clorinda in a large circle. The light was so clear that Clorinda could see the drops of water flying up from her feet. "Hurry," urged Clorinda, and the 3rd circle complete, the child darted away around the edge of the copse in the direction from which they had come. Left alone in the still moonlight, Clorinda wondered whether this were not her great chance to return home to safety and certainty. Then she saw a figure emerging from the dilapidated hut. The figure walked upright, but otherwise appeared to be a large furry animal, such as a bear or ape. From its distinctive staggering uncertainty of gait, Clorinda would have recognized Rufo even without the statements of the little girl. Moreover, he was still leaning upon his long crook, which stuck in the mud and had to be dragged out at every step. He, too, was going back round the edge of the copse the same way as the child. Although he showed no sign of intending to molest Clorinda, she found him a horrifying sight, and decided upon retreat. Then she became really frightened, because she found she could not move. The hairy, slouching figure drew slowly nearer, and with him came an intensification of the dreadful smell, sweet and putrid and commingled. The animal skin was thick and wrinkled about his neck and almost covered his face, but Clorinda saw his huge nose and expressionless eyes. Then he was past, and the child had reappeared. I ran all the way. Indeed, it seemed as if she had been gone only an instant. You're not to bother about changing because it's too late anyway. Clearly she was repeating words spoken by an adult. You're to come at once, although of course you'll have to be hidden. But it's all right, she added reassuringly. There have been people before who have had to be hidden. She spoke as if the period covered by her words were at least a generation. But you'd better be quick. Clorinda found that she could move once more. Rufo, moreover, had disappeared from sight. Where do I hide? I'll show you. I've often done it. Again, she was showing off slightly. Bind your hair. What? Bind your hair. Do be quick. The little girl was peremptory but not unsympathetic. She was like a mother, addressing an unusually slow child she was nonetheless rather fond of. Haven't you got the thing you had before? It was raining then, but Clorinda in fact had replaced the black scarf in her mackintosh pocket after drying it before the Carstairs kitchen fire. Now, without knowing why, she drew it out. Go on! Clorinda's sluggishness was making the child frantic. But Clorinda refused to be rattled. With careful grace, she went through the moonlit ritual of twisting the scarf round her head and enveloping her abundant, soft hair. The child led her back halfway round the copse to where there was a tiny path between the bushes. This path also was exceedingly muddy, plowed up, as Clorinda could see, by innumerable hoof marks. I'd better go first, said the little girl, adding with her customary good manners, I'm afraid it's rather spiky. It was, indeed. The little girl, being little, appeared to advance unscathed, but Clorinda, being tall, found that her clothes were torn to pieces, and her face and hands lacerated. The radiance of the moon had sufficed outside, but in here failed to give warning of the thick tangled briars and rank whipcord suckers. Everywhere was a vapor of ancient cobwebs, clinging and greasy, amid which strange night insects flapped and flopped. We're nearly there, said the little girl. You'd better be rather quiet. It was impossible to be quiet, and Clorinda was almost in tears with the discomfort. Quieter, said the little girl, and Clorinda did not dare to answer back. The slender, muddy trail, matted with half-unearthed roots, wriggled on for another minute or two, and then the little girl whispered, Under here. She was making a gap in the foliage of a tall, round bush. Clorinda pushed in. Shh, said the little girl. Inside, it was like a small native hut. The foliage hung all round, but there was room to stand up and dry ground beneath the feet. Stand on this, whispered the little girl, pointing to a round, sawn section of tree about 2 feet high and 4 in diameter. I call it my fairy dinner table. What about you? I'm all right, thank you. I'm always here. Clorinda climbed onto the section of the tree and made a cautious aperture in the boskage before her. The sight beyond was one which she would not easily forget. Clearly, to begin with, this was the maze, although Clorinda had never seen or heard of such a maze before. It filled a clearing in the copse about 20 or 30 yards wide, and consisted in a labyrinth of little ridges, all about 9 inches high. The general pattern of the labyrinth was circular, with involved inner convolutions everywhere, and at some points flourishes curving beyond the main outer boundary, as if they had once erupted like boils or volcanic blowholes.
In the valleys between the ridges, grass grew, but the ridges themselves were trodden bare. At the center of the maze was a hewn block of stone, which put Clorinda in mind of the stone of Scone. Little of this, however, had much immediate significance for Clorinda, because all over the maze, under the moon, writhed and slithered and sprawled the smooth white bodies of men and women. There were scores of them, all apparently well-shaped and comely, all, perhaps for that reason, weirdly impersonal, all recumbent and reptilian, as in a picture Clorinda remembered having seen, all completely and impossibly silent beneath the silent night. Clorinda saw that all round the maze were heaps of furry skins. She then noticed that the heads of all the women were bound in black fillets. At the points where the coils of the maze surged out beyond the main perimeter were other different figures, still wrapped in furs, which distorted and made horrible the outlines of their bodies. They clung together as if locked in death. Down to the maze, the ground fell away a few feet from Clorinda's hiding place. Immediately below her was one of these groups, silent as all the rest. By one of the shapeless figures she noticed a long, thick staff. Then the figure soundlessly shifted, and the white moonlight fell upon the face of the equally shapeless figure in its arms. The eyes were black and staring, the nostrils stretched like a running deer, and the red lips not so much parted as drawn back to the gums. But Clorinda recognized the face of Mrs. Pagani. Suddenly, there was a rustling in the hiding place. Though soft, it was the first sound of any kind since Clorinda had looked out on the maze.
"Go away, you silly little boy,"
muttered the little girl. Clorinda looked over her shoulder. Inside the bower, the moonlight, filtered through the veil of foliage, was dim and deceitful, but she could see the big eyes and bird-of-prey mien of the other child. He was still wearing his bright blue hooded garment, but now the idea occurred to Clorinda that he might not be a child at all, but a well-proportioned dwarf. She looked at the black ground before stepping down from the tree trunk, and instantly he leapt at her. She felt a sharp, indefinite pain in her ankle, and saw one of the creature's hands, yellow and claw-like, where a moonbeam through the hole above fell on the pale wood of the cut tree. Then, in the murk, the little girl did something which Clorinda could not see at all, and the hand jerked into passivity. The little girl was crying. Clorinda touched her torn ankle and stretched her hand into the beam of light. There was duly a mess of blood. The little girl clutched at Clorinda's wrist.
"Don't let them see," she whispered beseechingly through her tears. "Oh, please, don't let them see."
Then she added with passionate fury,
"He always spoils everything. I hate him. I hate him. I hate him."
Clorinda's ankle hurt badly, and there was palpable danger of blood poisoning, but otherwise the injury was not severe. "Shall I be all right if I go?"
"Yes, but I think you'd better run."
"That may not be so easy." The little girl seemed desolated with grief. "Never mind," said Clorinda, "and thank you." The little girl stopped sobbing for a moment.
"You will come back?"
"I don't think so," said Clorinda. The sobbing recommenced. It was very quiet and despairing. "Well," said Clorinda, "I'll see."
"Punctually? That makes all the difference, you know."
"Of course," said Clorinda. The child smiled at her in the faint moonlight. She was being brave. She was remembering her manners.
"Shall I come with you?"
"No need," said Clorinda rather hastily.
"I mean to the end of the little path."
"Still no need," said Clorinda. "Thank you again, though. Goodbye."
"Goodbye," said the little girl. "Don't forget. Punctual."
Clorinda crept along the involved, muddy path. Then she sped across the soft, wet sward, which she spotted with her blood, through the gate where she had seen Rufo, and down the hill where she had seen the pigs, past the ill-spelled notice, and home. As she fumbled with the patent catch, the church clock which kept ward over Mrs. Pagani's abode struck 3. The mist was rising again everywhere, but in what remained of the moonlight, Clorinda, before entering the house, unwound the black scarf from her head, and shook her soft, abundant locks. The question of Mrs. Pagani's unusual dwelling place arose, of course, the next morning. as they hurriedly ate the generously overlarge breakfast which Mrs. Carstairs, convinced that London meant starvation, pressed upon them. "Please not," said Clorinda, her mouth full of golden syrup. She was wearing ankle socks to conceal her careful bandage. "I just don't want to go." The family looked at her, but only Dudley spoke. "Whatever you wish, darling." There was a pause, after which Mr. Carstairs remarked that he supposed the good lady would still be in bed anyway. But here, most unusually, Mr. Carstairs was wrong. As Dudley and Clorinda drove away, they saw the back of Mrs. Pagani walking towards the church, and not a couple of 100 yards from their own gate. She wore high, stout boots, caked with country mud, and an enveloping fur coat against the sharpness of the morning. Her step was springy, and her thick black hair flew in the wind, like a dusty gonfalon. As they overtook her, Dudley slowed. "Good morning," he shouted. "Back to the grindstone." Mrs. Pagani smiled affectionately. "Don't be late," she cried, and kissed her hand to them.